Thank you. It was a sunny day with highs in the upper 30s when the buzzer sounded at Quigley Stadium, marking the end of the football game on November 25th, 1982. The buzzer marked not only the end of the game, but as the crowds who had filled the stands and cheered no doubt knew, it was the end of a 25-year tradition of Hall High and Central High facing off on Thanksgiving Day. While some in the stands may have remembered Central High and its predecessor Little Rock High School facing off against the Wildcats from the north side on Thanksgiving Day up to 1957, no one probably realized that a much bigger tradition was coming to an end. It marked 90 years of organized football games being played in Little Rock on Thanksgiving Day. Now, Thanksgiving Day football was a tradition not just for high schools in Little Rock, but all levels of football throughout the state and country. The Friday after Thanksgiving, newspapers carried stories and scores for professional, college, and high school football. It appears that the first Thanksgiving football game took place between Princeton and Yale in 1873. Now, there is record of an 1869 game that was probably closer to rugby than football. So the one game that everyone can agree was definitely what we know as football was Princeton-Yale 1873. Prior to the establishment of what is now Quigley Stadium, a baseball field had stood at the corner of 14th and Jones Streets. It was part of a city park property and it took its name from the park. It was called West End Field. The presence of the park lent its name to the street which formed the eastern border of it, which we call Park Street. Records indicate that the first Thanksgiving Day football game played at West End was in 1893. A year earlier, in what appears to be the first organized football game in Little Rock on Thanksgiving Day, a gridiron match took place at Clinton Park, which was a private park that stretched roughly from what is now the eastern border of current Clinton Park to what is now part of the Clinton National Airport property. That game took place in 1892 between the Little Rock YMCA and the Little Rock Athletic Association. The Athletic Association scored 32 points while the YMCA was completely shut out. Now, athletic competitions in the late 19th and early 20th century were very nebulous. High schools played colleges, schools played private clubs, colleges of vastly different sizes played each other. Because of the paucity of teams, one played who one could. This is reflected in the first decades of Thanksgiving football in Little Rock. The first Thanksgiving Day game at West End Park featured the private Little Rock Academy facing off against Hendrix College. Little Rock won 18-0. Now keep in mind at this point in time, scoring in football was different. A touchdown and extra point got you 6 points. And in looking back at a lot of the early football scores, you get some very bizarre numbers of scores. The next year, Little Rock Academy played Peabody High School, one of the city's white high schools, and beat them 12-0. With the exception of 1897 and 1902, the contests between 1895 and 1903 involved the Little Rock Athletic Association playing a variety of opponents, including Christian Brothers College, Ouachita Baptist, the Dallas Athletic League, and Fort Smith High School. Most of the games were extremely lopsided victories for Little Rock. These were particularly social occasions bringing between 1,000 to 3,000 spectators to West End Park at a time that the city's population was less than 40,000. The 1895 game, for instance, featured bicycle races on a track around the field prior to the start of the football game. In 1902, the Little Rock Athletic Association played its Thanksgiving game in Dallas. That day, West End Park played host to the University of Arkansas, playing the Arkansas Military Academy. In 1897, there was no athletic association game, but the Peabody High School played its seniors versus its underclassmen. The seniors won 16-4 in a very muddy game. Starting in 1905, a home and away series started between Little Rock High School and Fort Smith High School. In the years that Little Rock played in Fort Smith, West End Park would play home to college football games, usually the University of Arkansas or Ouachita Baptist. By 1913, Little Rock had won 5 Thanksgiving games and Fort Smith had won 3. The final game played out to a dismal 0-0 tie. Records don't indicate what led to the dropping of the Fort Smith Little Rock game for Thanksgiving, but by 1914 a new era was in place. Now, I will say 1914 there was a new head coach and a new assistant coach for Little Rock High School, and that assistant coach was a guy named by the name of Earl Quigley. So it may have had to do with a new administration coming in to change the series up. But from 1914 to 1933, the Tigers played a variety of opponents. They faced off against other Arkansas high schools, out-of-state high schools, a college, and even a team of soldiers. Their record in these 20 games was 18 wins and 2 losses. And while the opponents may have varied, each year the Tiger 11 lined up against their foes at home in Little Rock. The team had enough of a reputation they could invite opponents and never had to travel. Their 1914 opponent was Texarkana High School. The Tigers won by a score of 20-0. Crowd was 1,500 at West End Park, and that day they also saw Arkansas College, now Lyon, defeat Little Rock College, which was a private school and has no association to any schools currently in Little Rock. By the next Thanksgiving Day, the field at West End Park was known as Kavanaugh Field. It had been named in memory of William Marmaduke Kavanaugh, who had recently deceased. And it would have that name until it was replaced by Quigley Stadium in 1936. From 1915 until 1933, Little Rock would defeat Van Buren, Benton, and Hot Springs high schools, as well as high schools from Oklahoma, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Kansas, Illinois, and Missouri. 3 of their out-of-state opponents returned for a second time, so even though they got generally beat very badly, they obviously enjoyed their visits to Little Rock. And playing out-of-state teams garnered other benefits. In 1920, Little Rock played the Tupelo Military Institute, which held the Mississippi-Alabama Championship, and by defeating them, Little Rock claimed the state championships of Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. In 1917, they beat Arkansas State Normal, now UCA, by a score of 45-0, and the Gazette mused that the extremely muddy field was all that kept Little Rock from scoring even more points. The Tigers' only 2 defeats came in 1918 and 1924. 1918, they played a team from Camp Pike, and the soldiers that averaged about 20 pounds a player more than Little Rock did, and defeated the Tigers by 42-0. And then in 1924, they lost to Atlanta Tech High School by a score of 35-7. Now, while the games were serious business for the Tigers and their fans, it also provided for moments of entertainment. In 1923, the Tigers hosted a dance the night before at the Capitol Hotel for the visiting team from Birmingham, Alabama. In 1929, they hosted the previously undefeated Solden High School from St. Louis. At halftime of the game, there was a performance by the Little Rock High School Band as well as a group of girls known as Quigley's Quackers. The end of that game was Little Rock scored 26 and St. Louis scored 6. So after 20 years of playing a variety of schools on Thanksgiving, in 1934 they started a new tradition of playing their Cross River rival, the Wildcats, from the north side. They'd played a few games in the 1910s and 1920s, but had not played every year until 1931 and moved it to Thanksgiving in 1934. Now, for much of the 20s and 30s, a Thanksgiving Day game in Little Rock meant rain. That was the case in 34. The Tigers and the Wildcats played to a 2-0 win for the Tigers, and so not an auspicious beginning. Another notable matchup was in 1938, because with that win, Little Rock captured its first official state football championship, though the Arkansas Activities Association does now credit Little Rock High School with several previous state championships. The 1939 edition took place on what was known as Arkansas Thanksgiving. That year, November had 5 Thursdays. President Roosevelt had dictated that the 4th Thursday would be known as Thanksgiving, but several states wanted it to be the 5th Thanksgiving, and so they just observed it in their state on that day, on the 5th Thanksgiving. Little Rock won 6-0, but it was a messy game, and some sports fans joked that it was FDR's revenge. In 1941, they lost for the first time to the North Little Rock Wildcats just a few days before the U.S. entered World War II. The Wildcats repeated in 1942 in a game, repeated as winners in 1942 in a game that Orville Henry wondered, in writing for the Gazette, if it might be the last game for a while, because he feared that the players would be wearing a different type of uniform come future Thanksgivings, and that the rubber used in athletic equipment might be needed for the war effort. While some high schools did and colleges did drop football during World War II, neither Little Rock nor Little Rock dropped the football, so the games continued. And in 1943, the Tigers were back on top, winning by a score of 13-7. In 1947, both teams were undefeated, the first time they had both been undefeated heading into a Thanksgiving game. The Inky Wretches and Scribes were predicting another evenly matched slugfest. Instead, Little Rock owned the game and won 13-0. With the anticipation of a second high school to be opened in a few years, Little Rock High School was rechristened as Little Rock Central High in 1954. And this new school, to be named Hall High, opened in 1957. That first year, because it had a largely younger student body, they did not play up to their classification. They played smaller schools and B teams. So plans were underway, however, that their first Thanksgiving Day meeting would be 1958. So the 1957 meeting of Little Rock and North Little Rock would be the final times that the two teams would meet on Thanksgiving Day. Here's some photos from various Little Rock, North Little Rock football games. Little Rock Central High had obviously dominated world headlines in September or October of 1957 with the integration of the school by the Little Rock Nine. The sports coverage of the 1957 game, however, belied all the drama off the field. News reports focused on the Turkey Day game being the final game between the longtime rivals and the fact that it had a morning time start instead of the traditional afternoon start time. And this, incidentally, the 101st Airborne had left the day before, and so this was the first day that the school was monitored once again by the National Guard and by the Little Rock police force. In the end, the Tigers had the same result as they did on the first Turkey Day meeting, a win. The Bengals scored 40 points while the Cats managed only 7. So after 24 meetings on Thanksgiving Day, Little Rock had 19 wins, 4 losses, and 1 tie. Following the demise of their Turkey Day rivalry with Little Rock High School, the Wildcats set their Thanksgiving sights on Little Rock Catholic. And in 1958, they started a 21-year tradition of meeting on the 4th Thursday in November. Previously, Catholic had not had a regular Thanksgiving rivalry. They played a few times on Thanksgiving, but it was never the same team. The 1958 game continued the Southside dominance. The Rockets achieved a lopsided win over the Wildcats by a score of 26-0. The next several years saw close games. Sometimes Catholic would win, other times the Wildcats would win. In 1960, Catholic lost the game, but captured the state championship because of events at other games. It's kind of nice when you can lose and still be champion. While 1972 was the final game that a Rockets and Wildcats game had state championship implications, the two teams played until 1978. Due to conference realignment, Catholic High dropped from the 5A to the 4A starting in the 1979 football season. With that, they were no longer in the same classification as North Little Rock, and they therefore could not meet on Thanksgiving Day. Though in 1970, the North Side had acquired its own crosstown rival with the opening of Northeast, the creation of an all-North Thanksgiving Day tradition was never started. Likewise, Catholic could have potentially started playing Parkview High School when it opened in 1968. Both of those would probably have created very strong Thanksgiving Day rivalries, but by this time the Arkansas Activities Association was discouraging the tradition of playing football games on Thanksgiving. Having a game that late in the season interfered with postseason playoffs. Now in the 40s, they would, when playoffs were generally 2 weeks long, they would suspend playoffs for the week of Thanksgiving so the traditions could continue. But by the 60s, playoffs were getting more involved, and so they no longer wanted to suspend for Thanksgiving. Having a game that late in the season did interfere with the postseason playoffs, and even as early as 1961, they tried to dissuade the top conference from having Thanksgiving games, but the larger schools saw no need to abandon that. In fact, very often their football season was bankrolled by the proceeds from their Thanksgiving Day schedules. And so, when you had what had started out as the Big Six became the Big Ten, and then later the 5A, when you were only playing each other, there was no reason to have playoffs, and there was no reason to abandon your Thanksgiving games. In 1958, there were at least 23 high school football games played throughout the state on Thanksgiving. By 1965, that number had shrunk to 13, and in 1970, there were only 2 games, Hall versus Central and North Little Rock versus Catholic. Up through the early 60s, Thanksgiving Day football was a time for big rivals to meet. Many a Thanksgiving schedule involved seeing Jonesboro face off against Paragould, El Dorado played Camden, Fayetteville Springdale, Morrilton Conway, Newport and Batesville, which actually had the longest single Thanksgiving Day rivalry of 41 years, DeQueen, Texarkana, all longtime Thanksgiving traditions. College rivalries as well. For many years, Ouachita and Henderson fought the Battle of the Ravine on Thanksgiving Day. In the early days, football classifications were much more fluid, and the strengthening of classification and the lengthening of playoff schedule led to the demise of Thanksgiving Day games throughout the state. Either schools were not in the same classification, or they were in classifications that had playoffs that started prior to Thanksgiving. Gone were the days when a regular season extended from mid-September through Thanksgiving. The two exceptions were the largest classification of schools and the segregated African American schools. The largest class, which eventually became known as the 5A, had few enough members that they were all in one conference. A conference championship was tantamount to a state championship. The African American schools were ignored in athletics as they were in other areas. While the schools fielded teams and played each other, they did not have playoffs or the Arkansas Activities Association recognized championships. Up through the late 1950s, a mention of their games in the Gazette or the Democrat was rare. For several years, Little Rock's Dunbar High School Bearcats took on the Jones High Dragons of North Little Rock on Thanksgiving Day. Due to lack of coverage in newspapers, there are few records of these games. Unfortunately, the yearbooks of neither school shed any light either. Due to limited budgets, which led to thinner yearbooks, the football team usually got only one page, and that was devoted to showing the players, and left no room for details about their exploits on the gridiron. Another long-running Thanksgiving Day rivalry between African American schools was in Texarkana, where Texas's Dunbar High School faced off against Arkansas's Booker T. Washington High School. It lasted from the 1930s until 1967, when it ended due to the closure of the Texas Dunbar High School because of integration. In 1955-56, Little Rock opened a new high school for African American students, Horace Mann High School, and the Bearcat mascot of Dunbar, now a junior high, became the new Horace Mann mascot. Mann carried on the tradition of playing Jones on Thanksgiving. Many seasons, the African American Little Rock-North Little Rock football game was actually the second meeting of the season between the two teams. They usually played each other in September, and then again on Thanksgiving. The second game seems to have been as much about ensuring that the students, fans, and alumni also had a Thanksgiving Day game, just as most of the white schools had. Due to the lack of African American high schools fielding football teams at Arkansas, often the Little Rock and North Little Rock teams would have to play out-of-state teams. And while it was not unusual for Little Rock's white high schools to play teams from other states, this was because of prestige, not necessity. The same luxury was not afforded African American schools. In 1963, for instance, Horace Mann played teams from Oklahoma, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Texas. Their in-state rivals that year were North Little Rock, El Dorado, Pine Bluff, two different schools, Camden, Hope, Hot Springs, and Texarkana. Horace Mann's travel schedule was much more extensive than either Central or Hall had on a weekly basis. From 56 through 65, Mann and Jones met at Wildcat Stadium. After that season, the Thanksgiving game would alternate between Wildcat and Quigley. Since the Central versus Hall and North Little Rock versus Catholic games were in the morning, the Mann versus Jones games were afternoon affairs. As the Little Rock School District was gradually integrating its high schools in the 1960s, the Mann and Jones games continued. With the demise of Jones High in the spring of 1970, the Mann versus Jones series ended. Now, for many years, Little Rock dominated the state in football, first as Little Rock High School, then as Little Rock Central. The city's oldest high school won over 20 championships from the 1910s through the 1950s. With the emergence of Little Rock Hall, the 1960s were dominated by the city's newer high school. Together, these two schools led the state in football for over 60 years. While the 1970s and 80s saw less consistency in the quality of the gridiron prowess at Little Rock's two oldest high schools, come Thanksgiving Day, it did not matter. A Hall versus Central Turkey Day football game was often like a football season unto itself. The previous weeks of the football season did not matter. All that mattered was the Warriors against the Tigers. These games were always played at Quigley Stadium, which was at the time the home stadium for all of the Little Rock School District's high schools. Parkview having opened in 1968. Each year, Central and Hall would alternate which was the home team. The week leading to the game would feature skits and pep rallies at both high schools. Pranks, rumors of pranks, and threats of retribution would abound between the schools. Cars wrapped in orange and white would circle the Central campus one day, while black and gold cars would encircle Hall's campus the next. On game day, there would be special performances at the stadium by the drill teams, cheerleaders, and bands of both schools. The Tiger and Warrior mascots would taunt each other. Friendships between students at the rival schools were put on hold. This was all about the tradition and the game. Church services, family dinners, and any other activities were scheduled around festivities at Quigley. Hall High opened its doors and started playing football in '57, and as previously mentioned, they played smaller schools, so the first game was set for Thanksgiving 1958. Now, during the 58-59 school year, Little Rock's high schools were closed for the ill-conceived, ill-advised reason to keep them from being integrated schools. Though classes were not in session, football teams practiced and played. The Arkansas Gazette noted that most of the games that season, however, drew only 1,000 spectators, down from the usual 5,000 to 8,000 that normally Little Rock would get. With the future of Little Rock's high schools in doubt, there was some hand-wringing about whether the 1958 game would be not only the first meeting between Hall and Central, but perhaps the last. In only its second year of playing, Hall was undefeated and poised to win the state championship heading into the Thanksgiving game. Central surprised the Warriors by winning 7-0 before a crowd of 5,000, which cost Hall the undefeated season and the championship. El Dorado became state champs that year. This game set the tone for the high stakes of the rest of the series. The next year, classes were back in session at Hall and Central, and the future of the series was not in doubt. Hall achieved its first win with the 16-13 victory over the Tigers. Hall also captured a state championship with that win. Over the years, Thanksgiving Day game would deliver state championships to Central in 1960, 75, 78, 80, and 81. Hall walked away on Thanksgiving Day with championships in 64, 66, 69, 77, and 79. On several other occasions, Central or Hall kept the other team from winning a championship. The 1964 game was particularly memorable. That team for the Warriors contained future Little Rock Mayor Webb Hubble, future prosecuting attorney and Judge Chris Piazza, and future Little Rock City Director Dean Compuris, who was described by the Democrat as making an interception that changed the course of history. As an aside, I miss the days of sports writing from the 20s through the 60s. The language, the nicknames, the hyperbole. I fell in love with it while in college doing research. To this day, I miss reading about gritters, cagers, thin clads, the 11, the 5, the 9, and mentors on the sports pages. Stories may be more factual now, but I also think they're more boring. Back to Hall and Central. The 1980 game was notable for being played in snow. While Thanksgiving Day games at Quigley had often been played in rain, snow was a new experience. With changes to the state athletic conference classifications, the 1982 game was announced as the final Thanksgiving Day game between Hall and Central. The top two classifications were being combined, which would necessitate conferences and playoffs to determine the state championship. That meant that Hall and Central would need to meet before Thanksgiving Day. Going into the game, Hall led the series with 13 wins to Central's 8 wins. The 1982 edition lived up to the hype. This was the 25th edition of the Hall and Central rivalry. While there was no doubt Hall would end up with the most wins in the series, Central wanted to make sure they ended it the way they started it, with the win. Central boasted a 4-1 record. Pine Bluff and Parkview were both 4-1-1. Hall was 3-0-2. As long as Central or Hall won outright, the winner would be state champ. A tie would result in a 4-way tie for first place. And nearly 9,000 fans packed Quigley Stadium for a cold but dry day. As the buzzer sounded after 4 quarters, the Hall High Warriors were jubilant. They had won the game 14-3 after putting together a nearly flawless offensive effort. The win moved them to first place with a 4-0-2 record. Central, which had sat atop the conference most of the season, ended in 4th place with a 4-2 record. It also ended the Tigers' hopes for a 3rd consecutive championship. This game, like so many before it, provided high drama and excitement as it confounded some pundits, but it also lived up to its billing. And with that, the series concluded. Now, from 1983 to 2005, Hall and Central continued to play each other in football. This time, they continued to play for the Battle of the Bell. and that bell is proudly displayed at Quigley Stadium. After 2005, Hall moved into a lower classification than Central, and that put them on separate tracks facing different sets of teams. Now I want to backtrack to Thanksgiving 1969, not just because it was my first Thanksgiving, but it also saw 3 Little Rock high schools and the University of Arkansas all playing football games in Central Arkansas, and it appears that's the only time this has happened. It was a cool and misty day, which seemed to have made balls slippery and grass fields sloppy, but the precipitation seemed more of an annoyance than a barrier for the players and fans. The Arkansas Razorbacks, ranked number 2 in the nation, played host to Texas Tech Red Raiders at War Memorial Stadium. The two teams played before a crowd of 35,287, which was the smallest crowd that they'd played before in Little Rock that year, likely due to it being Thanksgiving and the presence of the Hall Central game just a few miles away. It would have been hard to fit in 2 football games, Thanksgiving meals, and a possible church service in one day. The Hogs were 16-point favorites for the game that was broadcast on ABC. Fans were encouraged to wear red to show up well on the color telecast. The Hogs beat the Red Raiders by a score of 33-0 in their penultimate regular season game. Finals Hogs regular season game that year was the shootout against Texas in Fayetteville on December 6th. That morning, Little Rock Catholic took on North Little Rock High School north of the river. The Rockets were 9-2 heading into the game, and the Wildcats were only 5-4, but they'd won 4 in a row. At the end of the game, North Little Rock was triumphant by a score of 21-12. Later that day at the same stadium, Jones High hosted Horace Mann. It would be the final game between Jones and Mann because Jones was being closed at the end of the year. The teams had met earlier in the season with Mann triumphing 13-8. Mann had a record of 2-8, and it was playing in the larger 5A or 4A classification, and Jones had a record of 4-6, and it played in the AA classification. It is notable that by 1969, the African American schools were playing integrated schools and were playing in Arkansas Activities Association conferences. Jones scored an upset victory over the Bearcats by a score of 19-8. Now, Quigley was less than 3 miles from War Memorial Stadium. Kickoff for Hall Central game was at 10 a.m. It was a sold-out crowd. Those that were not at the game could listen to it on KARK radio, now KARN. The damp field and high stakes of the game turned it into a defensive slugfest, and Hall had 2 fumbles while Central fumbled 4 times. At the end of the fourth quarter, the scoreboard showed a 0-0 tie. That's how it went into the record books. Hall's record was 9-0-1, and Central's was 6-2-2. That was actually the best season record Hall amassed in its 13 years of playing football. 4 football games within a few miles of each other also offers a snapshot into sports at the time. The Hogs were riding the crest of their 1960s football superiority in the Southwest Conference. Segregated public schools were coming to an end. Domination by Hall and Central in the state's largest sports classification. Soon Parkview would be added, and throughout the 1970s, all 3 public high schools would rotate winning state championships. While they lasted, Thanksgiving Day high school football games were civic focal points. For students who had grown up attending the games, the chance to play or cheer in a Turkey Day Classic was a rite of passage. Alumni home from college or visiting the family for Thanksgiving would descend on the stadium, ensuring the largest attendance of the season. High school football on Thanksgiving Day tells not just the tale of football, it reflects the changes in society. What started out as private sports teams became small high schools that grew along with the city. The addition of a second Little Rock High School reflected the city's growth. The presence of segregated high schools and separate but unequal football rivalries is an indictment of an unjust parallel education system. As Little Rock continued to grow and diversify, the 2 high schools playing on Thanksgiving were no longer the predominant schools in football or in other activities. But with state championships once again on the line, the last few years of the Hall and Central Thanksgiving rivalry were, in a way, a return to the halcyon days of the earlier face-offs, though this time with fully integrated teams. In addition to trading the top spots in football, the 2 schools were piling accolades in other areas. In fact, all 3 Little Rock public high schools had achieved a stasis that rotated areas of excellence academically, athletically, and artistically fairly equally among the 3 schools. There were undercurrents at work that hinted at future instabilities to come. Indeed, by 1982, the same year of the final game, The Little Rock School District had filed suit against the North Little Rock and Pulaski County Special School Districts, claiming the schools in those neighboring districts were siphoning off white students from the Little Rock schools. The ensuing realignment of schools and districts could possibly have brought an end to the Central versus Hall games on Thanksgiving, even if athletic reclassification had not. Central is now much larger than Hall. Parkview is a magnet school. 2 formerly county high schools and several elementary schools and junior highs were brought into the Little Rock School District in the late 1980s. Where once the Little Rock high schools were roughly equal in enrollment, they are now so varied they play in 3 different classifications. It is up to alternative historians to envision what continued Turkey Day Classics would have looked like after 1982. Little Rock has grown and diversified. Within the city limits, there are now 6 public high schools and 5 private high schools playing football. With these varied allegiances, it is unlikely to envision the same citywide level of interest in one football game. If you go to Quigley Stadium on Thanksgiving now, there are no crowds. The chirping of referee whistles has been replaced by the sound of birds which may fly overhead. The only old gold and orange are from the dried leaves which collect in corners or stick to fences. After 35 years, routines have become so ingrained that most people probably give no thought that they are not going to a football game. But if you squint your eyes and listen closely, the sound of the wind carries that long ago echo of cheers which emanated for 89 years at that location. Thank you very much.